As a nation, we face the most important 5 years I can remember. That is why I took the decision to call a general election. So that we have the strong and stable leadership we need. Strong and stable.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432.
Stop! He's already dead.
I know you're all waiting for my hot take, or by this point, lukewarm take on a Gillette advert, and that will be coming probably tomorrow. But this is more important and more interesting to me. The Brexit deal that Theresa May put forward was defeated, and it was about twice as bad as the people who were predicting disaster said. That is, I think, the most resounding defeat ever, and certainly since 1924. To give you some kind of context, it was defeated by twice as many people as voted for it. Nobody wants May's deal. Remainers don't want May's deal. Brexiteers don't want May's deal. Parliament doesn't want May's deal. The EU doesn't particularly want May's deal, but it's about as far as they're willing to move on anything. Now, a word of caution though, this is completely uncharted waters. This is completely unprecedented territory. This is shaking up the UK in a way that nothing else has since probably, you know, the 20s and 30s, the Great Depression or the World Wars. You know, this is the biggest peacetime change we've seen since the end of the Cold War, and probably more profound, I think. And anyone who tells you that they know what's going to happen is probably selling something. So, despite me having good historical knowledge and good political knowledge and everything, I don't know what's going to happen. I can make a few predictions, but you should take them with an industrial-sized grain of salt, just as you should whatever anyone else tells you. But yeah, if someone mentions sovereignty or respecting democracy, good odds they have no idea what the fuck they're talking about, because these terms in this context, as they're being used by people, are pretty much meaningless. For what it's worth, here's my prognostications, and I'll probably be proven wrong in some way by the end of today, let alone a week from now. The deal is dead. I don't think there is any reviving it unless the EU is willing to move significantly from their current position, and I don't see that happening at all. I could be wrong, I probably am to some degree. May doesn't have really a lot of room left to manoeuvre. If the ERG had held fire on their attempt to depose her till now, I think they probably could have removed her as leader if they triggered that now. But that ship has sailed for at least a year, so that can't happen. Corbyn has called for a vote of no confidence in the government, which everyone was assessing that he was likely to lose. He's still likely to lose it because the Conservatives don't want to be out of power, and they're more afraid of Jeremy Corbyn than they are of continuing to fuck up spectacularly. They'd rather be in control of the crashing car than give someone else a chance to drive. So the scale of the defeat yesterday tips the odds slightly in favour of a no confidence vote in the government, but I still reckon that will fail. Now, what happens then? Then, essentially, Corbyn, against his will, is hedged in to supporting a second referendum, which is where the impetus seems to be. Whether May will continue to try to run out the clock in a game of national chicken isn't particularly clear, but really the only way out that saves face, respects democracy, as people like to say, and so on, is to have a second referendum, and that would be my preferred option. It's divisive, but it's the least divisive option. It's undemocratic in the eyes of some, but it's the most democratic option moving forward. Technically, the Prime Minister, the Executive, or Parliament could withdraw Article 50. There's legal advice in two different directions there, whether we can only withdraw it on the promise that we intend to make a proper go of the EU or not. But in theory, Ken Clarke seems to think, the governmental legal advice seems to think, that we can just unilaterally withdraw it. However, if Parliament did that, that would incense the right and the far right to a massive degree, and a lot of moderate people as well. It would be seen as dictatorial, even though traditionally Britain has been a parliamentary democracy and Parliament is considered sovereign, so they have the right to do that. That is kind of the point of a representative democracy. But in this atmosphere, in this situation, after a referendum, it doesn't really fly too well. It ruffles too many feathers. The only politic way I can see to move forward is to have a referendum. But how do you conduct that, especially in light of the previous referendum? That's kind of where I think the direction is headed, but I think there's problems with that. I mean, you're going to aggravate people anyway, but there's other problems. The previous referendum was not legally binding, was marred by illegality, lies, nonsense, was perverted by 30 years of the Murdoch press bashing the EU, all the rest of it. Some of that can't be undone, some of that can't be dealt with. There was the whole Cambridge Analytica, and there's been suggestions of Russian intelligence interference and so on that seem to hold true. I know, Mo Russia, whatever. But the point is that that vote was never binding and was completely marred by nonsense. Any future vote has to be seen to be squeaky clean and free of this sort of interference, and the bill introducing it has to be legally binding. Parliament has to bind itself to the result of any future referendum, so there can be no question. It has to be completely above board, it has to be unperverted, maybe even no real campaign, just the question, you know, and people discussing and talking about it, but no campaign, you know, a moratorium on campaigning around it. So what would the question be? This is the other sticking point. What do you ask? I mean, May's deal is dead, but so much of her political capital and effort is invested in it that she would probably want her deal to be on any referendum. I don't think that's viable, but the trouble with having that on a potential referendum is that it would split the people who want no deal and people who want a softer Brexit, which would be unfair because Remain would then have a massive advantage. Yeah, it's a big problem, and I think a lot of Brexiteers understand that plenty of people who backed Brexit didn't want a no-deal Brexit, which is why they're afraid, I think, of it just being no deal versus Remain. So what the referendum would be is still a massive sticking point, and you could do it as a transferable vote system, rank in order of preference what you would want, and then you'd have Remain, May's deal, no deal. So, you know, if you wanted no deal, but there wasn't a majority for that, maybe you go for May's deal second, and then the votes would carry over, and May's deal would win. Or maybe you want May's deal, but if you can't get May's deal, you'd rather Remain. Perhaps, you know, it's a single transferable vote or a ranked order is a way around that, but that's finicky and traditionally hasn't been the kind of thing that we want. So it's just all really interesting and weird, and I just want to talk for a little bit about the implications rather than the Brexit thing itself. I want to talk about how it has affected British democracy and our institutions and the way in which we approach it all. To understand Britain's ambivalence towards the European Union, I think you have to understand that our tabloid press has long been against it, long lied about it. The Murdoch press as a whole has been very much against it. And psychologically, Britons don't think of themselves as being part of Europe. This is a bit less true of Scotland and other regions, but in England, certainly, most people don't think consciously or unconsciously of themselves as Europeans at all. They don't consider Britain to be part of Europe. Partly, I think that's down to the channel, this moat we have from the rest of Europe. Being an island nation, we've seen ourselves as separate, or the saviours of Europe, even in the world wars. And in the same way that many Americans turn their backs on things that would be good for them because they consider themselves to be temporarily embarrassed millionaires rather than an oppressed proletariat, so Britons seem to think of themselves as a temporarily embarrassed empire rather than a faded, modern European nation that needs to be part of an alliance in order to keep its soft and hard power in the world. So that side is interesting from a geopolitical perspective, and I think, like Suez before it, this whole kerfuffle, however it turns out, will hammer home to another generation that we are not an empire anymore, that we are very much bound to other nations, and that we are weaker without them. I think that's a necessary lesson that has to be relearned. We can't continue huffing our own nostalgia and getting high on the fumes. We have to face up to the realities of the world, and one way or another this is going to cause that to happen. What's been really interesting for me is that over my lifetime and a little bit beyond, the role of the Prime Minister has been becoming more and more presidential. Thatcher really ramped that up. She dominated and terrified her cabinet, the executive, and was very much the avatar of the Conservative Party and of Britain, unfortunately, to an extent throughout the 80s. Now, while that was pulled back a bit in successive government, Blair also took a very presidential approach to the leadership. And then when he lost, that kind of went away again a little bit. But Cameron still took a fairly presidential lead in going about things, and May has done the same thing, though she doesn't really have the charisma to pull it off. But what we've seen now is Parliament pulling back on that, retaking power from the Prime Minister and the Executive and rooting it back into Parliament by challenging and knocking down May when she tried to move forward in a more presidential, dictatorial manner, telling them what they could and couldn't do and trying to take control over Brexit entirely into the Executive. This is a good thing. Parliament retaking control in that way. Yeah, this is the sovereignty that people argued so strongly for. So that is really interesting from my point of view. Have we seen an end to presidential style prime ministers? Hard to tell. If Corbyn did get in, his is very much a cult of personality amongst the Momentum people and so on, and he may lead a presidential government. Certainly the way he runs the Labour Party is fairly autocratic and presidential as well. His approach to Brexit has ignored the party, has ignored the trade unions and so on. Clearly he's a man of conviction, but that conviction does not seem to include representing his bloc very well or very accurately. So that's interesting. The fractures in the Union, the danger of losing Northern Ireland and Scotland as a result of all this, I think this is interesting and important. And perhaps one of the biggest long-term effects that we might see is that they're never going to trust referenda again for at least a generation. You know, we had the AV referendum, we had the Scottish independence referendum, and this one, and all three were really quite divisive in a lot of ways. And in many ways, people voted against their own best interests in every case. And because of that division, and because of the clusterfuck that is Brexit, I think that's going to be used as an excuse not to directly ask the people for quite some time to come. And it may contribute to there not being another Scottish independence vote. But a lot depends on how things shake out moving forward, and it's too unpredictable to call. Good luck to us all. Zang.